Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, a weekly news show that takes us around the world to find what's going on. And helping us to do this week is Bianna Golodryga, who is CNN Senior Global Affairs Correspondent. Bianna, great to have you on the show.
Great to be back with you, Ivo.
Also joining us is Ravi Agrawal, who is the editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy magazine, and importantly, the podcast host of Global Reboot. The second season dropped just this week. Ravi, great to have you back.
Great to be on, Ivo.
And Philip Stevens, former correspondent, now contributing editor at the Financial Times, and also the author of Inside Out newsletter, Substack newsletter, where you can follow his insights as you did in the Financial Times before. So, Philip, great to have you back as well from your four-month stint in Florence, back in London.
Yeah, back in London. Greetings.
Well, a lot of things to talk about. The Biden trip to the Middle East, which is now moving today from the Palestinian side to Saudi Arabia over the weekend. We'll look at Ukraine fatigue in Europe as the crisis in the energy markets seem to really start to hit home. We'll take a look at what's happening in post-Boris Johnson Britain as the Conservatives find a new leader. And lastly, we'll look at a really big developing crisis in Sri Lanka, the collapse of the government there. Let's just dive right in, Ravi. First of all, with the Middle East trip that Biden is now on, he had a very, very good visit, it seems, in Israel. He had a visit to the West Bank and the Palestinian territories, and off, of course, to Saudi Arabia for a meeting with the Gulf Cooperation Council. What have you seen in the trip? How did you think it went? And what can we expect this weekend when the president meets with MBS, the Saudi de facto leader?
Well, so the trip began on Wednesday, and I'll just sketch it out a little bit for our viewers who haven't been following the headlines as closely as us news junkies have. Before I get to a larger point I want to make about the trip and where I think it's going to emerge come Sunday or Monday. So Biden's been president for 18 months, and he's been to Europe twice. This is his first visit to the Middle East as president. There's been a lot of debate, as we all know, here in the United States about whether he should recommit to the Middle East or continue to prioritize the rise of China as a core foreign policy priority. So, arrived in Jerusalem on Wednesday. There was a lot of friendly rhetoric on both sides. Biden said he's proud to say that U.S. relations with Israel are deeper and stronger than they've ever been. That, of course, I think is debatable. Israel's current prime minister, Yair Lapid, described Biden as a great Zionist. And I think all of this belies some of the larger tensions between the two countries over the last few years, and the fact that the Biden administration has continued to struggle to get Tehran back into the Iran nuclear deal, which of course Israel opposes. I think that's a major sort of backdrop to this trip. Of course, even though it's not at the front of the agenda, it is an issue that the Biden administration has struggled with, especially given the fact that it needs Iranian crude to come back online, and that's a big part of the visit. On Friday, just to continue, that's today, Biden drove to Jerusalem, from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. That's just a 15-minute drive. Interestingly enough, he drove past a giant mural of the late American Palestinian journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. This visit was very different in tone. I mean, Biden had earlier recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital, did not acknowledge Palestinian claims. And in the West Bank, he openly said that this isn't the right moment to start peace talks. And I think in a sense, it signals a sort of American resignation that the two-state solution just isn't on the table, as it isn't in Israel. And of course, we could spend so much time talking about Middle East peace, but I think, the more interesting and fresher part of this whole leg is the second part of the trip. So today, Friday, Biden's going to fly directly to Jeddah, the first time an American president has done so. Could be the start of a new opening of relations between Israel and Saudi, perhaps even an extension of the Abraham Accords, which so far has covered the UAE and Bahrain, Jordan previously. He's also going to attend a meeting of the GCC+3. This is all just an acronym fest: Egypt, Iraq, Jordan. There's also I2, U2, that is India, Israel, UAE, USA. But out of all of this, the Saudi visit is just going to be fascinating. I mean, is there going to be a handshake moment with MBS, Saudi's crown prince? Saudi, just to end, I think has just long been the main place where American interests and values have collided dramatically. And I think, Biden at various points in his presidency has kind of said that American foreign policy under him is about three things. One would be a foreign policy for the middle class. Two would be aligning democracies against autocracies. Three would be centering human rights. These three are colliding in Saudi Arabia. His stated hope is to get Saudi to pump more oil. That'll bring down crude prices. That's realism. That's a realist foreign policy. It's a foreign policy for the middle class. But that clashes entirely with the idea of a foreign policy that's centered around human rights. This week, I think all of those contradictions will be in full view for the world to see. So it's a very tough week, I think, for Biden.
Bianna, I think Ravi makes a really a good point at the end here in terms of that conflict that, frankly, every president has had in one form or another between the idealist sense of America and the values that we believe and champion and of course the national interest, which sometimes means that you have to deal with countries as they are, not as you would like them to be. And I think that's clearly the case in the Saudi sense. It's also been the case in the Israel-Palestinian conflict, where there is a similar contrast between values on the one hand and interests on the other hand. How do you think the Biden administration has dealt with that conflict compared to, others who've had to confront this reality?
Listen, we've talked about this on at great length, but it's almost a luxury when you're a candidate to talk about idealistic values and American values, especially coming, as you are going get an election against Donald Trump, right? Who seemed to cozy up very closely with MBS. And so you heard the president, then candidate Biden, say that they were going to make Saudi Arabia a pariah state. I mean, look at what's happened in just a few months' time. You have a that has spiked, gas prices and oil prices around the world, and food as well in other ways. So when you're president of the United States, there are certain differences between what you espouse as a candidate and what you have to deal with holistically on the ground. I think, we have rightly so spent a lot of time talking about American values and what he said about upholding human rights and going at Saudis in terms of their human rights abuses, not just with Jamal Khashoggi, but obviously the war in Yemen as well. I think on the one hand, one can understand that there is a crisis at hand. And so the president, while he's spoken at great length about how important human values are to him, as president of the United States, he's also very aware of the suffering that many Americans are experiencing now with rising inflation and gas prices. So I think the bigger question is whether or not one can trump the other in terms of going there and actually making a difference in bringing down the price of gas and oil prices, pretty quickly, even if we do hear any pledges from the Saudis and the Gulf members there in the Gulf states about whether they will release and produce more oil, what impact that will have and how quickly that could actually be seen and transcend, to global markets around the world. Because I think at best you have experts and analysts suggesting that this won't be something that we would see and that Americans would feel for another few months at best. And he's got an election to focus on, midterms, obviously, for his party there. So I think that this is clearly a juggling act between talking about his past promises and his past budget, and now actually as president of the United States going there, and he's tiptoed around this idea. I mean, I think at this point it's sort of, we need to get past this, the question of whether, and he keeps saying, well, it's not about meeting him, he's just going to happen to be there. I mean, we know what this is about. It's just a matter of whether he can actually get a deliverable to bring back to Americans, and I don't think that he'll be able to in terms of any real pledges or impact on oil markets.
Philip, how do you see it? Clearly, the Europeans, they need oil, so that's one thing they will be looking for. They've always been strong on a two-state solution. They're not getting that, but they've looked at the United States as the deliverant of that. And of course, there's the Iran nuclear deal that remains a project that the Europeans started, are centrally involved in, but again needs the United States to come to a fruition. So how are the Europeans looking at this trip? Are they worried about the conflict between sort of realism, the national interest and values, or are they just focused on what's the result, what can we get out of it, and how can Biden square that circle in a way that will benefit them in the long run too?
So I think Ivo, the Europeans are very much on the side of realism in this. I mean, you do catch a bit of schadenfreude about the American president who said it was a pariah state now has to go there cap in hand, and you catch a bit of that in the commentary and from some diplomats. I won't say from which countries, but you can probably guess. But on the other hand, when you have serious conversations with people, there are two things that matter. One, as you said, energy prices. So anything that Biden can do to get Saudi Arabia to pump more oil, Europe will be grateful for. And secondly, relative stability. No one thinks the Middle East is going to be, become overnight a stable place. But America's return, if you want to call it that, adds to a hope that while Europe is burning in the sense of the war of Ukraine, it doesn't have new conflicts, new fights in the Middle East to worry about. So there's no one really pushing the president very hard on the two-state solution. His words on Iran were noted that the US will not allow the Iranians under any circumstances to have a nuclear weapon, but that's seen as the sort of standard American position, nothing new there. And anyway, the view is that the Iranians are looking now perhaps towards a threshold capability, not to actually building a bomb. So I think, although, being ungrateful people, the Europeans won't admit it, they're basically quietly applauding this visit.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And just on the Iran issue, Ravi, but also more generally, interesting that the president did in fact say that we, the United States, would not allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon, whereas the Israelis were saying a nuclear weapons program. And there's a big difference between the two, particularly as Philip rightly said, they have a nuclear weapons program. It is active. But if you are a threshold state and don't cross the line, that difference between the United States on the one hand, and frankly, not just Israel, but the Saudis, the UAE, and others on the other hand, who want this problem solved by U.S. military power, that is a festering problem for the U.S. And it's not clear that Biden is going to be able to resolve that in a way that will satisfy anybody in the region.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's a tough tightrope walk. I mean, as Philip says, I think going back to the most important thing right now for Washington, that is the war in Ukraine, quite simply. And that, in a sense, is animating this entire trip. If you think of, eventually the Saudis, I mean, my understanding is that nothing will come out of this trip right now, but in a couple of months, likely in a somewhat connected, not connected way, the Saudis will begin to pump more oil. And similarly, the main sort of reason animating urgency behind the Iran nuclear deal is to get Iranian crude back online. Of course, Israel's sort of motivations here are a bit different from America's. They would never were fans of the Iran nuclear deal, and they don't want to go back into it, of course, or the world to go back into it. So I think it was very interesting, as you say, to parse through Biden's comments and him trying to find some space there between Washington's stance and Jerusalem's stance. I think we'll continue to see that. But really, I mean, the larger issue of the Iran nuclear deal, even outside of Ukraine, has been one of profound frustration for Washington. It was an issue they didn't take up early enough, I think 18 months ago. And now that they're doing it with, their hands tied behind their back, because the Iranians know that America's desperate to get more oil online, especially with summer driving season on here. Inflation is rampant as it is.
Yeah, as Ravi said, a lot of this, of course, is driven by the Ukraine conflict, Bianna, and let's switch to that. Clearly, we're in a different stage, both inside the conflict itself, with the Russians have apparently pausing the direct ground offensive, but launching missile after missile at cities and towns around the time, and a sense that, particularly in Europe, but even in the United States, the costs of this war, the externalities of the war, the energy crisis in particular, make it more likely, if people wanted to say, can we figure out a way to get over it? The fighting goes on. But there is less and less willingness to stand by and have it go on. How do you see it, Bianna? How do you see the conflict? What stage are we in? And how likely is it that this kind of fatigue that you hear in the U.S., you hear it in Europe, will translate into pressure on the Ukrainians, because the pressure on the Russians apparently isn't working, to think about a diplomatic or at least a ceasefire outcome?
Well, clearly this war has now turned into a war of attrition. And it does appear that Vladimir Putin has sort of dug in this assumption that the West will, sort of grow tired of this and grow into sort of a fatigue. He's watching democratic countries do what democrat countries do. They have to fight the will their constituents, and sometimes that looks ugly. And so whether what we saw in France or what we're now possibly experiencing in Italy, and obviously what we saw in the UK with Boris Johnson leaving, I mean, all of this is bad news for Ukraine and really good news for Vladimir Putin. He's the only constant in this equation here, having now been Europe's longest serving president, i.e. dictator. And it's really coming at a point where it is a question of how long can the West continue to support this war and Ukraine's effort in fighting back Russia, while also dealing with crises at home? And first and foremost, obviously, that is energy crises. And you hear just yesterday Macron giving an interview, celebrating Bastille Day there and commemorating that by reminding French citizens that they are going to be in an energy crunch. And this is really a crisis that they're going to be facing as they have been so dependent on Russia for oil and gas. There really is no plan B, and that they are in a race against time now in these last summer weeks as winter and fall is approaching. The same, obviously, we saw it with Germany. And who would have thought that, just last year, would have thought that Europe's largest economy would be facing such a vulnerable situation, right? It's a clear mark against Merkel's legacy, but also, the future of green technology, where Europe was sort of the shining beacon in technological advancements on that front and turning to renewables. And now we realize they had no real alternative as a fallback to Russian oil and gas. So I think Vladimir Putin thinks he can hold on for as long as it takes. And it's really great to hear President Biden say that the U.S. is in it for as long as it takes as well, in terms of delivering weapons and financial aid to Ukraine, even though the bulk of it is coming from the U.S. It is a question of how much can the U.S. just do this alone, and how much can Europe continue to provide not only financial and military support. It looks like that's sort of dwindling at this point, but even political support, as you're seeing some of the biggest supporters of President Zelensky now having to turn their focus back to domestic problems at home. This is, I believe, already one of the longest land wars that we've experienced in modern history. And you ask anybody at timetable as to when they think this could end, we're talking months, if not years. And meantime, the atrocities continue. The attack in Venezia, where we've seen 23 civilians there killed, including small children. I mean, that is just going to continue as time moves forward. And you can even see, in terms of our coverage, this has been a priority for CNN. But again, other news developed, right? And so, whereas just a few months ago, Ivo, when we'd have you on, we'd spend a whole hour of a show covering the war in Ukraine, now it's down to 10 minutes. And I think that's reflective of not only the media landscape, but obviously the global landscape and breaking news and people turning into their own domestic issues. So I don't think anyone's changed how they view this war personally and view it as an assault on democracy in a sovereign country. But in terms of any pressure that this puts on Vladimir Putin to bring it to an end, I think the longer this goes on, the more we continue to deal with inflation, the more we'll question, who these leaders are going to be. And some of the biggest supporters of Ukraine in the months ahead. I do think we're starting to hear more and more, at least behind closed doors, questions about, okay, what can be done to bring both sides to the table and at least call for a ceasefire.
I think, Bianna, that's a depressing, but I think very accurate sort of layout of where the sentiment is. And I guess the question that I keep having, and Philip, let me put it to you, is the leaders themselves are pretty committed openly. As long a little while ago as just the G7 meeting, they said they would do whatever it takes to support the Ukrainians. And so how do you think they're going to be able to manage the domestic political incentive to push for quick settlement, even though, by the way, quick settlement is pretty hard to think about how you're going to achieve that, even if you want to push it. And at the same time, try to do what you need to do in order to make sure that Putin doesn't succeed, which is also ultimately what everybody is united behind. How do you see them trying to do this? Boris Johnson was doing it for political reasons for a long time. In Britain, it's going to be hard, but it's going to be hard everywhere else, including for the United States.
Yeah, I'm going to push back a little bit because I'm a little bit more optimistic than perhaps you are. I mean, there are clearly sort of mixed, swirling emotions here and different judgments. And it is fair to say that when Europeans look at the war, they say there's no easy end in sight. And they're talking about at least into next spring and beyond. Question for the short term: can the Ukrainians hold the line in the Donbass against this sort of incremental Russian advance? I think there is some optimism they can, but they don't really have the force to push back. So we are looking towards a stalemate. But what I've noticed is that whereas a month or two ago you had people like Macron and Scholz saying almost publicly, look, we've got to think about, the day after and the accommodate, and bringing Russia back into some sort of security arrangement. That seems to have gone away. And I think it's gone away for two reasons. One, although this has fallen off the headlines, I think if you said to public opinion in Europe, okay, we're going to basically give Ukraine away, you would have a huge pushback despite the increases in energy prices. So people are alarmed and fed up about, higher gas prices, but I don't think sufficiently so to say, okay, maybe we should let the Ukrainian, let the Russians win in Ukraine. So I think there's that balance there. I think there is also, I think we saw this at the NATO summit, an understanding that Europe has pulled together, NATO has pulled together to see this split open now. And it would be a split because you'd have the countries in the eastern and northern side of the continent, arguing for a much, sort of more tougher line against Russia. I don't think anyone, including the most sort of the softest, want to see that broken open. So I think at least into the autumn, we're going to have a fair amount of solidarity. The question is, I think, if come November and December, people, are having blackouts and people are going to, having to put industry on short time because there's not enough gas, will that tilt the balance? But I think at the moment, there is a fair amount, despite all the misgivings and all the worries about energy prices, I think there's a fair amount of consensus that for now, the only choice is to stick with it.
Ravi, how do you see that? I think Philip makes good point. I mean, there is this realization in alliances that that if one brick falls apart, the whole thing falls apart, and so you better stick together because the alternative is far worse. Even if the specifics is fine, the long-term alternative is worse. Is that how you see it too? That ultimately the leadership thinks longer term when it comes to making sure that we.
Hi there. I think I lost my internet for a second, but I'm back now. The way I see it, interestingly, I think, one of the things that Bianna kind of portrayed is conventional wisdom, that time is running out for the West, winter's coming, gas prices will get very high, and that indeed, there are just immense fears that Europe might not be able to hold it together. I think, as Philip also pointed out, November is an interesting time period to look towards with the midterms in America. If Trump and Trumpism is back, can the American Congress, can America still support continuing to support the Ukrainian efforts to fight off Russia? There is another side to this. And I actually had a very interesting interview with Fiona Hill this week in Foreign Policy. And, she made the point that time is running out for Putin as well. And we in the West shouldn't forget that. He, too, is deeply concerned about potential long-term economic impacts and short-term. He, too, has lost a lot of people that will begin to bite sometime soon. The thing he fears most of all, perhaps, is popular dissent, which often comes from concerns over pocketbooks. All of that's coming to bite, and the clock is ticking for him too. I mean, he has elections in 2024 before America does, and those are elections that he too might be a little bit worried about. So I think, it's important for the West to stick together. As Philip says, there's sort of this collective realization that they're in it now to stick through it for the here and now, for the medium term at least. Longer term, who knows? But, for me, one thing I do want to point out here, and that this is clearly an existential fight for Ukraine. There is a larger existential fight for the world here that we shouldn't forget, and that's the climate change impact. And I think, Europe clearly made a mistake in depending too much on Russia for its energy needs over the last decade or so. It mustn't make the same mistake again. It must figure out ways to diversify its energy sources. It must figure out ways to do so in a way that's greener. It needs to figure out how to get nuclear back online. And I think this is the moment for the rest of the world to invest heavily in the likes of India and other developing countries to be able to develop greener sources of energy sooner rather than later. Otherwise, we will be back here again in a few years. That, for me, is the bigger takeaway from this moment that I hope world leaders are considering seriously.
Bianna, jump in here, because I think both Ravi and Philip make the point about the importance of maintaining Western unity, which I think we all agree with, but also that somehow we've crossed a certain threshold here, and particularly in Europe when it comes to energy. You can't go back. There is no going back to where it was before. You don't have an alternative to going forward, and that reality plus the need for unity, and perhaps the pressure on Vladimir Putin may give you more sense that this, in fact, can end well. Just because it's hard today doesn't mean it necessarily has to be a failure tomorrow. How do you look at that?
No, I agree. And these are strong points that Philip and Ravi make. I would just argue that, Russia is still participating in the G20 this year, right? At least it's not because of the U.S. Or anybody other than the host deciding to include Russia. And we've seen sort of public protest and walkout, the storming out of Lavrov in these meetings. But Russia is still a global player. And while I do think this obviously war did not go the way Vladimir Putin had envisioned, I wouldn't count him out just yet. Unfortunately, I think that suppression clearly works in Russia, and we saw at best maybe a few thousand people turn out in protest in Moscow. We estimates, suggesting maybe as many as 200,000 people had left the country. I don't necessarily think Vladimir Putin was hoping that they would stay. And their oil revenues continue to come in. And while they are not going to enrich themselves necessarily, he'll be able to sustain the country, as one analyst said, to turn it into a quasi-Iran type of hermit state. Not a country anyone would want to live in, any of us would want to live in, but enough to sustain their population and turn to China, right, and continue to sell oil to both China and, as Ravi mentioned, India is a big player here. India continues to be buying Russian oil as well. So I think as much as we'd like to see this war come to an end very soon, the question is, what does that look like? And does that mean that, as Zelensky says, going back to pre-February 24, boundaries? And I don't see how Vladimir Putin would agree to that. I don't think he's feeling much resistance, at least now. And we know that can turn on a dime, as we have in past revolutions and coups. But I don't see any indication that the Kremlin and his leadership is losing power right now or overly concerned. Every single dissident or would-be political opponent either left the country or is in prison. So I think all of those factors combined, what does a victory look like? And what does that mean for Ukraine if, in fact, there isn't even in some sort of agreement that they could come to? Does that mean a Donbass where Russia has taken over a large portion of the country? As of now, they've taken over about 20% of the country, and Ukraine is the second largest country in Europe. But we're talking about, as one person put it, 3 Estonias that Russia has now grabbed. So how can a functioning sovereign country move forward with Russia still having a permanent presence there? And so what Vladimir Putin, clearly envisioned going into this war did not play out for him. But if, as he told the Russian people, it was just to liberate the Donbass, every day that he's taking more and more of a chunk there. So I agree with you that a unity amongst allies is important here and amongst the West. I just wonder how much longer Ukraine can sustain itself. Economically, I think they're looking at a 45% decline in GDP just this year alone. I think you have European leaders already warning about preserving gas now. What does that look like when you're in the midst of winter months? So there are a lot of variables here that are still up in the air. The U.S. and the West continue to provide financial and military aid. But Ukraine continues to lose soldiers, on a daily basis. And so they're being trained. The UK is playing a big role in all of this. But I do think it's just a matter of who's going to be exhausted first. And that's a big question now in the fighting.
I think Bianna, you're exactly right. This is a question of who's exhausted first, and there's sort of 3 players. There are the Ukrainians, of course, who are heroically fighting for their own country. There are the Russians, who are trying to take as much as they can, and then there's the Western support that goes as part of that. And we'll have to wait and see who gives up first. The likelihood is that no one does, in which case this war continues with all that it entails, lack of victory on the Russian side, but also extraordinary costs on the Ukrainian side of blood and treasure that we see every day with the horrific missile attacks that are now going on a really almost hourly basis. We'll be back to talk about all of this, I'm sure, in the weeks ahead. In the meantime, let's switch over to the drama in London and in Westminster, where a week after Boris Johnson stepped down or said he would step down as the leader of the Conservative Party, and assuming there is a new leader, then as Prime Minister as well. A fight for his succession is ongoing. And the real question, I guess, Philip, is not only who's going to come out on top, but what then? How will that change the course of Britain's involvement in the world and in Europe, and perhaps also with Ukraine and others?
Okay, well, as you say, there's the good news. Boris Johnson is going to be out of 10 Downing Street by September the 5th if the leadership election for a new Conservative leader goes to plan, goes to schedule. And just to explain, it's a two-part contest. The MPs by next week will have chosen two potential candidates. Then through August, they will go around the country doing hustings in front of Conservative Party activists, 100,000 of them or so, 120,000, not that many, and they will each have a vote, and the activists will choose between the two. Now, so the good news is Johnson's gone. Britain no longer has a charlatan and a liar as its prime minister, and there's quite a lot of cheering even in the Conservative Party, but far beyond. The not so good news is that there isn't actually a sort of sparkling lineup of potential successors. It's whittled down now formally to 5 so far, and there are some more votes next week. It's really between 3, a chap called Rishi Sunak, who was the former chancellor before he quit Johnson's cabinet and helped provoke Johnson's downfall, a former international affairs and briefly defense minister, Penny Mordaunt, and the existing Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss. Sad to say, the battle between them has not really been about the future of Britain or the direction of Britain. It's been about the fighting in the Tory party, about Brexit, about should there be big tax cuts, should they cut spending. And what we're witnessing so far in this contest is a really badly divided Conservative Party with 3 pretty lackluster potential leaders. And you can't really, you look at any of them and say these are game-changing politicians. The front runner at the moment is, in terms of votes among the MPs, is Rishi Sunak, who's a technocrat, who's a sort of stable technocrat. And so in a sense, people would say, well, at least, the country may be properly run. The front runner is actually Penny Mordaunt, who's the least well known. She's a former naval officer, and she has a sort of common sense appeal, particularly to party activists. She's not a great intellect. I don't think she'd claim to be. She's a steady as you go candidate, as it were. I suspect it could well be her. The most unpredictable candidate would be Liz Truss, who is, according to some of her colleagues, is fun, but also a bit mad and a bit bad, and she's unpredictable. But actually, it seems to me the Conservatives have been in power for 12 years now, and we're looking really, after all the sort of energy that went into Brexit, all the anger and resentment and rancor that created within the party and the infighting, we're looking at a party at the end of its period in government. So my guess would be whoever is the candidate, they'll be sort of limping along for the next 2 years. On the big issues like Ukraine, don't expect any change of policy. I think, sad to say, we're not going to have a great rapprochement with Europe because all 3 candidates are saying they're going to continue this rather futile fight with Brussels about the Northern Ireland trade arrangements post-Brexit. I think with the United States, all 3, profess, their fealty to the special relationship, as it's sometimes called. But I don't think anything, if one of them, whoever gets elected, I guess, would get to Washington maybe in the autumn. I don't think any of them will be promising much different to Joe Biden.
So I think that's a great summary, Philip, and sort of plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose, Bianna, to coin a British phrase or use a British phrase, that in many ways what you're predicting is stability when it comes to foreign policy, and presumably also more attention to the problems at home, which are growing with the cost of living crisis, inflation, strikes, the kind of things that, frankly, we haven't seen in Britain for quite a long time, meaning that if anyone was riding the British tiger to the rescue on global problems, they're probably going to be disappointed. Is that a fair? Is that how you see it, Bianna?
No, I think Philip laid it out perfectly. And I do think that while we're not, the good news is that there's not going to be much instability or uncertainty on major issues like Ukraine. I think the role Boris Johnson had hoped to play for the United Kingdom, both, vis-a-vis Ukraine and just its standing as a standalone outside of the EU, I think that's going to greatly diminish now, right? And focus is really going to turn domestic and internal. I think sort of President Biden summed it up when asked about Boris Johnson leaving, saying that's part of the process. So in other words, good riddance. But what does that mean as far as the UK sort of leading the world on many fronts? I don't see major headlines coming out of that direction. And listen, we still haven't talked about, maybe it's a good thing, I don't know. We still haven't talked about COVID. We haven't talked about, there's still a lot of other issues that are plaguing not only, Europe, but the world as a whole. So what happens in the fall? That these variants continue. Boris Johnson sort of took a victory lap after having quite a beating early on in the pandemic. The U.S. also a major issue with what happens with the pandemic going forward. So I think there's still a lot of unknown variables here.
Can I just add one thing to that, just so you're all reassured? Liz Truss, never a modest person, says that if she becomes prime minister, she will guarantee that she will continue to lead the free world against Russian tyranny. So one could be perhaps assured.
I saw that, so I'm very reassured. It's very good to know that continues. Ravi, we only have a few minutes left. And I do, while I also do say what you want to say on the Johnson and British situation, but also give you an opportunity and really would like to hear from you on what's happening in Sri Lanka, which is, rare to see a state collapsing as quickly as this one is. And I think we really are talking about a state collapse here.
Yeah, I think, everyone summed up British politics quite well here. Frankly, I'm just pleased to see that we won't have to discuss Boris Johnson's fate anymore. We've all gotten tired of that. So moving on. Sri Lanka, honestly, is just a heartbreaking story. This is a beautiful island country of 22 million people. It, for many years of the last decade, was the best performing Asian economy across many metrics, GDP per capita, but also growth rates, other indicators in terms of human development. And really, it has reached the point now where it has no money to purchase fuel. It has no money to buy food and medicines. Even the middle class in Sri Lanka now is cutting back to a meal a day. Such a tragic scenario for a country that was otherwise doing so well. To quickly get everyone up to speed, really the economic crisis that it's in right now is largely because of politics. Over the last few years, Sri Lanka has been ruled by a family, essentially, the Rajapaksa family, which had its fingers in every single ministry, really, defense, foreign affairs, the prime ministership, the presidency. And what they've gone and done is they have just messed it all up, really. Over the last few years, they went on a spree of state spending, infrastructure spending, ruinous economics, really. COVID happened for a country that depends on exports as much as it does and tourism as much as it does. That hit them hard. The war in Ukraine then hit them hard again because of inflation. And basically, Sri Lanka's run out of money. And the Rajapaksa family is largely to blame. They have now escaped. Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who wasn't until recently president, has fled to Singapore now, won't be able to last there very long. Singapore has a large Tamil population. He will not be popular there, given that he was defense minister when he sort of ended the civil war in Sri Lanka. Human rights crimes, accusations against him still running strong. Really now, just to wrap up, Sri Lanka's economic crisis led to a political one. The political crisis has made the economic crisis worse. They don't have a real president with legitimacy. They don't have a stable government. Until they get a stable government, they can't really go to the IMF or the World Bank and get funds in. That is the crisis Sri Lanka's in. So very quickly, they need to elect a new government. The parliamentarians need to get together, find a unity government that has some backing, some popular mandate, get that unity government to then go cap in hand to the IMF, to India, to places that can lend them money in the short term, and then hopefully, once they have a stable government, put in place tough economic reforms. Sri Lanka really, this obviously small country in isolation, but it encapsulates a problem that many other highly indebted countries around the world are going through. Think of Pakistan, think of maybe even Argentina, Turkey, many others. This is not the last of the COVID-related crises in economics that we're going to see.
Ravi, I think you summed that up really very, very well. And it is a microcosm of a crisis that we are seeing in other parts and likely to continue to see in other parts of the world as well, with a combination of the COVID shock and then the oil and energy shock and the food crisis all on top of that. And then the one area you didn't mention, the indebtedness in this case to China, because the Chinese invested a great deal of money, and that investment also turned out to be costly for the people of Sri Lanka, as opposed to the Chinese government, a big part of the problem that we see. And it seems to me just a forewarning of the difficulties that we're going to see and are seeing in all the parts of the world. So thank you for bringing us up on the speed in that. And fortunately, that's all we have time for to this week. We'll be back, of course, next week with another edition of World Review. In the meantime, I want to thank Ravi Agrawal, Philip Stevens, and Bianna Golodryga for their contributions and insights. As always, learned a lot. I hope you all watching did the same. Come back again next week. Take a look at our podcast if you have. And in the meantime, I want to wish everyone a bon weekend.
Thank you. Great to join you.
Thank you.
Thanks.